Something extraordinary happened today, and it's not what the headlines are showing you. While American media obsesses over domestic political theater, the rest of the world just redrew the economic map of the 21st century, and the United States wasn't in the room when it happened. This morning in New Delhi, the European Union and India finalized a trade agreement that has been negotiated on and off for 2 decades. The timing is not accidental. This deal arrives just days after the most severe diplomatic rupture in NATO's entire 77-year existence. What we're witnessing isn't just a trade agreement. It's a strategic realignment of global power. The 2 largest democracies on Earth by population have just created an economic corridor that deliberately excludes the world's 3rd largest democracy. And they did it because they no longer trust Washington. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you explains why American farmers, American manufacturers, and American workers are about to face a future their leaders haven't prepared them for. Let me start with what triggered this acceleration, because none of this makes sense without understanding what happened last Thursday. President Trump appeared on Fox Business and made a statement that detonated across every allied capital simultaneously. In defending his threats to withdraw from NATO, he claimed that American allies in Afghanistan, nations like Britain, Canada, Germany, and Poland, had positioned themselves away from the fighting while American soldiers bore the burden alone. The reaction was immediate, and it was unlike anything we've seen in modern transatlantic relations. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer didn't issue a carefully worded diplomatic statement. He called the comments appalling and insulting. His voice carried genuine anger, not political calculation. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius went further, breaking decades of diplomatic protocol. He appeared on public television and demanded a formal apology. He said it was disrespectful to speak about Allied casualties in that manner. He said the claims were simply untrue. Now let me show you why the reaction was so volcanic. Because the data makes Trump's statement not just offensive, but factually demolished. The United Kingdom lost 457 service members in Afghanistan, 457 families who received the worst news a military family can receive. Canadian forces lost 158. Germany lost 59. Denmark, relative to its population, suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any coalition member. These soldiers weren't guarding supply depots in safe zones. They were in Helmand Province. They were in Kandahar. They were conducting combat patrols alongside American Marines in the same terrain, facing the same improvised explosives, dying in the same dust. When the President of the United States dismisses that sacrifice as staying back, he isn't making a policy argument. He's telling allied nations that their blood has no value to him. And here's what the coverage misses. This wasn't just an emotional wound. It was a strategic clarification. European leaders have spent years hoping the Trump phenomenon was temporary. They believed they could wait it out, manage the relationship, preserve the alliance through careful diplomacy. That hope died last Thursday. If the American president doesn't honor the blood their soldiers spilled fighting alongside Americans, he certainly won't honor treaty commitments to defend their borders. The Article 5 guarantee, the promise that an attack on one NATO member triggers a collective response, only works if nations believe their partners value the alliance. That belief is now gone. And so Europe stopped waiting. They stopped hoping. They started building an alternative. Let me walk you through what happened in New Delhi today, January 27, 2026, a date that historians will mark as a turning point. The European Commission described this as the most significant trade agreement in the Union's history. The numbers justify that characterization. The deal creates a unified market of over 2 billion consumers. That's more than 6 times the population of the United States. It eliminates tariffs on 96% of European goods entering India, a country that has historically maintained some of the most protective trade barriers on Earth. India doesn't open its markets casually. They've rejected trade liberalization for decades, protecting domestic industries from foreign competition. For Europe, they made an exception, a massive exception. Consider automobiles. European manufacturers trying to sell cars in India have faced tariffs of 110%. That's not a trade barrier, that's a trade wall. Under this agreement, that tariff drops to 10%. Think about what that means for German automakers. Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, they're currently being squeezed by Trump's tariffs in the American market. Their sales projections for the United States are declining. Now they have tariff-free access to 1.45 billion potential customers in the world's fastest growing major economy. They didn't lose a market. They swapped a declining one for an ascending one. The concessions extend across sectors. Wine tariffs that stood at 150% are being eliminated. Machinery tariffs of 44% gone. Chemical tariffs of 22% gone. Pharmaceutical barriers eliminated. In exchange, India receives tariff-free access for 99% of its exports to Europe. Textiles, leather goods, jewelry, industries that employ tens of millions of Indian workers now have direct pipelines to Paris, Berlin, Milan, and Madrid. The timing creates a perfect strategic alignment. Indian exporters facing Trump's new reciprocal tariffs of 25% to 40% suddenly have a European door swinging open. European manufacturers facing American tariff walls of 15% to 25% suddenly have an Indian door swinging open. This is economic warfare conducted through partnership rather than punishment, and the United States is the target. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was explicit in New Delhi. She said, "This agreement demonstrates that rules-based cooperation delivers results." That statement is directed at exactly one person. The message translates simply, "We don't need you to prosper." Now, let me explain what I mean by a strategic exclusion, because you can't formally expel a nation from the global economy. There's no mechanism for that, but you don't need one. What happens instead is quieter but equally effective. Intelligence sharing becomes selective. Trade routes get redrawn to bypass certain ports. Summit meetings, where real decisions get made, happen in hallways before the formal sessions begin. The G7 becomes G6+1, where the American president arrives to find agreements already reached. This is happening now in real time. While the United States withdraws from international organizations citing globalist agendas, the rest of the world is building new institutions that don't include Washington. The isolation isn't being imposed. It's being constructed through exclusion. Consider what's happening in European strategic thinking. For years, the concept of strategic autonomy was academic, a theoretical framework suggesting Europe should develop independent defense capabilities. Brussels bureaucrats discussed it in position papers. Nobody treated it as urgent. Today, it's a survival strategy. The EU-India agreement contains substantial provisions on defense and security cooperation. They're not just trading consumer goods. They're discussing maritime coordination in the Indo-Pacific, cybersecurity frameworks, intelligence sharing protocols. These are conversations Europe used to have with Washington. Now they're having them with New Delhi. India is making parallel calculations. The Quad Alliance, the partnership between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia, designed to counterbalance Chinese influence, looked promising 2 years ago. India was a cornerstone member. But American unpredictability has changed the equation. Tariffs on Indian goods, threats to restrict visas, erratic policy shifts that make long-term planning impossible. Indian strategists are diversifying their partnerships. They're betting that a relationship with Europe offers more stability than alignment with an administration that changes positions weekly. So what does this mean for Americans who aren't tracking geopolitical developments? What's the tangible impact on ordinary people? The isolation of the United States carries real economic costs. They're not theoretical, they're already materializing. The administration believes tariffs will force manufacturing to return to American soil. They call it economic revival, and there have been investment announcements. Japan pledged significant manufacturing commitments last year. But economists note that corporate pledges and actual factory construction are different things. Commitments evaporate when conditions change, and the immediate reality is inflationary pressure. When you impose 25% tariffs on imported goods, prices increase for American consumers. That's not complex economics. That's arithmetic. But the deeper danger is market displacement. American agricultural producers, soybean farmers in Iowa, corn growers in Nebraska, wheat producers across the Midwest, they depend on export markets. When Europe and India create a tariff-free trading zone between themselves, American farmers find themselves at a competitive disadvantage. A French agricultural producer can now sell to Indian buyers without tariff costs. An American producer faces barriers. When an Indian importer chooses suppliers, they'll choose the cheaper option. This is called trade diversion. It happens gradually. It doesn't make headlines, but it quietly destroys market positions that took decades to build. The EU-India agreement gives European companies first mover advantage in a market of nearly 1.5 billion people. By the time American policymakers recognize the strategic error and attempt to negotiate competing access, the market will already be captured. Indian shelves will stock German appliances, French wines, Italian fashion. We're surrendering the market of the future because we're consumed by grievances rooted in the past. The projections are stark. By 2030, EU-India trade volume is expected to double. Simultaneously, US-European trade is projected to decline by 15% due to ongoing tariff conflicts. Superpowers don't lose their status in dramatic battles. They lose it because the rest of the world learns to conduct business without them. And we cannot discuss this realignment without addressing the Greenland situation. It sounds absurd. It is absurd, but it's actively accelerating NATO's fracture. President Trump has renewed demands that Denmark sell Greenland to the United States. Denmark refused again. The response was tariff threats against a NATO ally. The Arctic context matters here. Climate change is opening shipping routes and resource access that didn't exist before. The strategic value of Greenland is increasing. American interest makes geopolitical sense. But the method is catastrophic. By threatening a loyal NATO member with economic punishment for refusing to sell sovereign territory, the administration has terrified every small country in the alliance. Sweden, Finland, Norway, they're watching Denmark's treatment and drawing conclusions. The United States is no longer viewed as a protector. It's viewed as a potential predator. This has pushed Nordic nations deeper into European Union defense mechanisms and further from NATO's American-led command structure. Every threat adds another brick to the wall of isolation. Historians will likely identify January 2026 as an inflection point, the moment when the Eurasian Rim decided to integrate without Atlantic participation. The administration promised to prioritize American interests. In a certain sense, that promise has been fulfilled. America is now first in isolation, first in tariff rates, but last in the rooms where the future is being negotiated. The exclusion isn't formalized. No document expels the United States from anything. But when allies build new economic systems that bypass you, when they sign historic agreements without you, when they demand apologies for the dismissal of their sacrifices, the practical effect is the same as formal isolation. The agreement is signed, the terms are set, the tariff walls are rising on one side while they're falling on the other. Welcome to the restructured global order. For the first time in a century, the United States is navigating it largely alone, not by accident, but by choice. The consequences won't arrive all at once. They'll unfold over months and years. But the American response, likely additional tariffs, will arrive within days. So watch the trade flows. Watch the diplomatic appointments. Watch which summits produce real outcomes and which produce only photographs. Those signals will tell you whether this realignment accelerates or stabilizes. And they'll tell you what kind of economic future American workers and families should prepare for. The world didn't wait for permission to move on.